Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Happy Thursday, everybody, and welcome into GC Live Afternoon Drive. It is November 9th, and the Gamecocks are getting set to host Vanderbilt, part of a 4-game stretch of playing home games to end the regular season. USC needed that win last week. It wasn't pretty. Certainly wasn't pretty in all three phases. But at the end of the day, they were able to get a win. And because of that, now you have an opportunity to still control your destiny. And of course, we're talking about controlling your destiny. We're talking about being able to become bowl eligible, but certainly it starts with getting a win this weekend against a Vanderbilt team who, look, I get it. 15 straight years, USC has had their number. Some of those games, though, I think it's been 5 in that time frame that it's come down to a one-possession game as far as USC being able to win those games. So that, on top of the fact of what we've seen with USC throughout the course of the season, I don't think anyone should just assume this will be a cakewalk by any means. Certainly, I believe South Carolina will win this game and win this game by 2 scores. But as I'll get into the keys before we have our guest on today, they need to be able to do the things that we've been talking about ad nauseum about with this team. Because if you don't, not only are you going to lose this weekend if you play sloppy football, but as we know, you lose to Vanderbilt, my goodness, I don't even want to know what the message board, social media, it's going to be a cesspool. Before we get into the keys of the week, as we do every week, just a reminder, today we have a special guest. That is ESPN's Field Yates. Field Yates will be hopping on. Many of you know Field from fantasy football. You see him on ESPN talking about the NFL. He'll be giving us some insight as far as where he's hearing a guy like Xavier Legette, where he's thinking a guy like Legette, Spencer Rattler, and even Juice Wells, where they would fall in this year's draft. Maybe he has a thought or two on whether it would be a good idea for Juice to return. So we'll get into that as well. And if you have any questions, be sure to join the conversation by leaving a message, whether you're watching on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, wherever. Leave a message, question, whatever, and we'll get to it. We'll also be sure, though, on the opposite side of that to talk more about this weekend's matchup. So without further ado, we'll get into it before Field joins us in a little bit. Field will be on around 2:15. But in the meantime, as we do every week, let's get into our keys of the game. And the first key for South Carolina, for me, you have to be able to force turnovers. I mean, how many times have we talked about that throughout the course of the season? And finally, for the first time since September 30th, last week, USC was finally able to force a turnover. And not just one, they forced 4. And the last time they did that, you have to go all the way back to November 5th of 2022 against, ironically, Vanderbilt. Since we're going to be talking Vandy today, that's when the last time they were able to do that. They did that last week, of course, against Jacksonville State. Being able to do that, to me is a confidence booster because it's been on their minds. They've had opportunities before that. And whether it be a fumble recovery, whether it be a missed opportunity of coming up with an interception, we talked about the Missouri game, that first touchdown pass that Mizzou scored in that game through double coverage. USC wasn't able to get that takeaway that they were looking for. Took them a couple games, took them 15 quarters to finally snap that streak. So I bring that up because now you have the confidence, right? It's like one of those coaches back in the day when you were a youth basketball player, and they'd say, visualize the ball going through the hoop. And you go out there and you knock a couple free throws down and you start feeling more confident about yourself. Same deal with being able to force turnovers. You finally see it's like, all right, we knew that we could do this, but now we've actually been able to see it. Ending that drought. Again, 15 straight quarters before being able to get that. I think it was a fumble recovery was the first one to end that streak. I think it was, who was it? Was it Tonka? Tonka came up with the fumble recovery, Tonka Hemingway, to finally end that streak. And then Stone Blanton iced it. He had the pick 6. Also had O.D. Fortune going out there, coming up with a interception as well. Had 4 takeaways in that game in total. But the reason I bring that up is because this USC defense continues to stay in the field a lot. 90 plays they faced last week. Now, certainly the style of offense that Jacksonville State plays with in comparison to what we'll see this weekend with Vandy. High tempo, similar to what Tennessee likes to do. But this is a defense between that game and some of the games earlier in the year. 70-plus snaps, 80-plus snaps. Last week, 90 snaps. Help yourself out. Get off the field. And it's not just helping yourself out as a defense when you create a turnover. Helps the offense out, right? Because including that Stone Bland pick six, 3 of USC's takeaways led to points on the ensuing drive by the Gamecocks. The only one that didn't led to 2 kneel downs to end the game. So I bring that up because this Vanderbilt team, they have been god-awful with protecting the football this year. Vandy has turned the ball over 17 times. That is tied for the 15th most by any team in FBS this year. Having said that, that leads me to my second key of the game, protect the ball. Right now, the forecast does not look that great. It's going to be raining, it seems like, early in the morning, even heading into the game. And because you're playing on natural grass, that field, especially at this time of the year, even though they do a tremendous job of preserving that field could be a little sloppy. Could be a little sloppy. You need to make sure that you protect that football because Vandy is tied for second in the SEC in takeaways. They've forced 14 turnovers so far, 11 interceptions, 3 fumble recoveries. Now, USC, all things considered, when you look at the issues with them this year, one thing I feel like we don't talk about, which is a good thing, is that they haven't really had issues with protecting the football this year. Knock on wood after I say this, because, again, weather's going to be not great. You're going up against a team that has had a lot of success with forcing turnovers this year. But when you look at South Carolina, they have turned the ball over, I believe it is 10 times this year. And the majority of those turnovers have come in desperation times late in games. When I'm talking about desperation mode, I'm talking about, it could be down 2 scores or even the Florida game. You're trying to force something to happen, right? You're trying to do a little too much, too much. So I bring those things up because with South Carolina, again, protect the football. This is a very opportunistic defense. You can't afford to turn the ball over. And again, as I mentioned, yes, USC has won the last 15 meetings against the Commodores, but 5 of those games have been decided by 1 possession. You think back to just 2 years ago, the Zeb Nolan game when he had to come in and save the day. All it takes is one extra turnover, and that could decide the game. Got to be smart with the ball. Got to be careful. Got to protect the football, especially if the weather's not that great. And then we'll get to your questions, David. I see you on the side. We'll get to you just a little bit. Number 3, look clean on special teams. The ironic thing about this matchup, as Pete Lembo pointed out yesterday during his press conference, Vanderbilt actually has 3 coaches on their staff that at one point, once upon a time, they coached under Pete Lembo when he was a head coach, including Vandy's special teams coordinator. So I bring that up because this is a special teams unit that they're going to be sound. They've actually been really good when you're talking about just net punt. Number 1, actually, in the country, believe it or not. They're going to be sound. They understand what Lembo ball and all that stuff is about. They're going to be ready to go. The big thing for me isn't necessarily the fact that you're going up against a Vandy team that, again, a lot of familiarity with Lembo and understands what South Carolina likes to do from a special team standpoint. It's the fact that you've been playing some sloppy special teams as of late. Some pretty sloppy special teams. The last couple weeks, and I say sloppy, and I've mentioned this before, when we talk about USC special teams, at least this year, because of the standard they've set over the last 2 seasons, we hold them to a higher standard, right? There's a curve there when we're grading them. So I bring that up because back-to-back weeks, Xavier Legette, who's been absolutely a monster, and we're going to talk about Xavier with Field Yates in just a little bit. He's been a monster at wide receiver, but he's had 2 straight weeks kick-catch interference penalties. You also think about missed opportunities on block punts. I can think of 2 that come to mind in the last 2 games. There's been missed opportunities to be able to down the football inside the 10-yard line. So when we're talking about being crisp on special teams, those are the things I'm talking about, right? And as much flack as much flack as Kai Kroger has received this year, and some of it rightfully so, USC still ranks 32nd in the country in net punting. Just over 40 yards, which is about 5 yards off from Vandy, who, again, leads the country. But I bring that up because you think about some of these dumb bonehead penalties, the kick-catch interference penalties, not being able to down the football inside the 10. There's been even opportunities to down the ball inside the 5. Doing things like that, it's going to screw up some net. It's going to screw up your net. But it's not just, again, from a statistical standpoint, it's about being able to help yourself flip the field, all those kind of things. So, look, if there's opportunities to block kicks this week, and certainly USC needs to take advantage of it. Talking about just the weather, how it might not be that great this weekend. Sloppy conditions, that can slow down the operation time from the long snapper to the punter. Never mind the fact that the ball could slip out. So I bring these things up because, for me, thinking back to my college days as a rusher on the punt team, it could slow you down, especially when you're playing on grass. When you're trying to get that get off, might not be as clean. But at the same time, too, it certainly can slow down the operation time. So if you do have an opportunity to block a kick this weekend, you got to take advantage of it. You can't give up because, again, there could be opportunities where you feel like you might not get there in time, but the ball might slip. Center might have a bad snap. Got to continue to play through it. So those are some of the things that I'm looking for out of South Carolina this weekend. Let us know what you think are some of the keys this weekend, and we will get to that. Again, Field Yates from ESPN will be joining us momentarily. Talk about the draft, a lot of draft stuff as far as, what to expect maybe for a Spencer Rattler. Xavier Legette, certainly. I mean, he's just 27 yards away from becoming the 5th Gamecock to eclipse 1,000 yards receiving in a season. Now, this would be the 6th time because Sidney Rice did it twice. But in addition to that, you also have Alshon Jeffrey, over 1,500 yards receiving. He holds the record. Sterling Sharp's on that list, and also Pharaoh Cooper. So a pretty elite list. Pretty good class right there. If Xavier is able to get the 27 yards this weekend, be able to get that out of the way, and then you still have 2 games to go after that, at least, where he can try to do what he can to get closer to that all-time mark by Alshon Jeffrey. So we'll talk again with Field Yates in just a little bit. Also, I'll bring up to him just his thoughts, his overall thoughts on Juice Wells, if he's been hearing anything from scouts, teams out there as to what makes the most sense for Juice. I mean, I've said it many, many times before, especially in this era of NIL, that I think it is in the best interest of Juice to come back for another year. Never mind the fact, too, the news that came out yesterday, that Senior Bowls are expanding, starting this year. You don't have to be a senior now to play in the Senior Bowl in some of these other senior games, because there's a couple of them. It's essentially the upperclassman bowl. You could be a junior now and get invited. Can that impact a guy like Juice Wells? I know that might sound silly to some, but, I mean, if you look at it from a mathematical standpoint, there's only X amount of spots as far as how many guys get invited to some of these senior games. So I'll be interested to hear what Field has to say. And speak of Field, there is Field Yates of ESPN. Phil, good to see you, man.
What's going on, Mike? How are you, my friend? Good to catch up as always.
I know. I mean, you haven't. This is a new look for me. This beard. I don't know how long this is going to go. Girlfriend's not a fan of it, but
what? Why not?
Well, I mean, I looked more like, and I know you're a Boston guy like me. I always looked like Paul Pierce if I ever tried to grow one back in the day, look like the Etch-a-Sketch. So start off as lazy, and then now,
I'm going to get up and close and personal. I've been shaving in a week, and this is all I got. So you're doing better than I am with that Paul Pierce looking beard right there.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't know how long it's going to last. And I will say before we get going, we've known each other for 10 years. And one thing that I'm very, very proud to say, I have never asked you for any fantasy football advice.
Well, you can ask away whenever you want. Fire away. I only have a couple of ground rules. I guess there's one rule more so than anything else. Is let's just say the great Mike Yuba says, "Hey, I got some questions here. I need a choice between." I'm just going to make this up. Terry McLaurin and Tyler Lockett this week. If you ask, and my answer is I got McLaurin, and you then respond, "Really?" or how come, or are you sure? Then we stop. Because here's the deal. We're getting peppered with these questions left and right all day, every day. I don't have time to give you a TED talk about why I prefer Terry McLaurin to Tyler Lockett. Sometimes it's I could spell it out for you very clearly. Other times it's my gut call. And if you're going to ask, I hope that you're asking not because you want confirmation of your own thoughts, but because you want my thoughts, and you'll use them to help inform your decision. But I know that if you ever have a fantasy football question, please feel free to fire away.
Yeah, you can catch Field on Fantasy Focus. You guys probably tune into that on Sundays. I know that this is a college state. Some fans will, lean towards the Carolina Panthers. Some will just, gravitate towards whatever. So, again, Field, obviously, you got to go to when it comes to fantasy football, but you've also been very locked in, again, for over a decade when it comes to the draft. And I know you put a tweet out a couple weeks ago that got a lot of Gamecock fans excited, because it's one thing if one of the local guys like myself or someone else says, man, Xavier Legette, like, man, what a phenomenal job.
Yeah.
He's doing. Okay. I knew this was going to happen. Is Lockett too risky to start right now?
JP.
Fantasy questions now.
Yeah. But, JP, the answer is no. Good matchup this weekend.
But you put a tweet out just talking about what you've seen with Xavier. And I think for so many of us that have followed his journey, never mind the fact of what he's done on the field. I mean, he has a phenomenal background story, everything that he's gone through, if you haven't heard about that, Field. But his size, his speed, the numbers he's putting up, I just mentioned before you hopped on, he has a chance to become the 5th Gamecock in program history to eclipse 1,000 yards receiving in a season, just 27 yards away. You have Alshon Jeffrey on that list, Sidney Wright twice, Sterling Sharp, Pharaoh Cooper, so some pretty elite company. For you, though, what is it about Legette, as you've continued to watch more about him, that really just stands out? Because, again, I think the size and speed speaks for itself, but I don't know if there's anything else.
The size and speed definitely is a starting point. And as you think about how players are going to be evaluated in the pre-draft process, and then when they'll where or when they'll end up being drafted once we get to late April, I think you have to remember that in the NFL, the size and speed combination are always going to prevail, right? Because if you're an NFL team and you're trying to decide who should we be taking, you are always sort of examining the possibility of that player reaching his top outcome. And the top outcome for a guy who's 6'2", 225 pounds and can run like the wind, like XL, is probably higher than the same outcome for a guy who's 5'11", 195 pounds and can run fast, but maybe can't run with that same level of power and speed combination that you're getting from Xavier. So he has this unique combination of size and speed that we've been talking about, but his body control is just sick. There have been a couple of plays this year where it's almost like he goes up and like he can time a jump perfectly on one play and then high point the football, which is a very difficult thing to defend when you're his size. If you're reaching the ball at its highest point, it's just tough to come down with a pass breakup or even force an incompletion, no matter who you are on defense. But there have been a couple of plays where it almost feels like he's like mistiming his jump, but he can just hover and gravitate above air and find a way to come down with the football. And he's so good after the catch, right? One of the best receivers in the NFL, not the very best in the NFL in terms of run after catch skills, is a fellow Gamecock and Deebo Samuel. These two guys are very different, size, stature for sure. But Xavier's so good with the ball in his hands after the catch that he's going to be a very, very highly drafted player.
I don't know how much you've had an opportunity to talk with different teams, scouts, about Xavier in particular, but I think one of the more impressive things, so I mentioned that list, right? I mean, you have some phenomenal wide receivers, Alshon, Sterling, some of the receivers that have been able to eclipse that 1,000-yard mark in a season at USC. I think to me, what stands out the most is Legette didn't have the numbers during the last 4 seasons, COVID year, so he has a 5th season to play. Last season, he only had 167 yards in total. In the 4 years combined heading into this year, he had 423. I mean, just last week, he put up over 200. It was named a co-national player of the week from an offensive standpoint. So I bring those things up because how much of what a player is doing towards the end of their career impacts more so with their draft stock in comparison to maybe the entire body of work.
Well, it's a good reminder, Mike, that we are projecting these players, right? There are guys throughout the college game that the production is not what would strike you as like first round pick or top 50 pick or first 2-day pick, but the traits are. And that's kind of the golden rule from my scouting days. And it got hammered over the head a million times over to me. We draft traits, we don't draft production, right? Now, traits usually lead to production. So if a guy's very productive, he usually has some pretty darn good traits. But there are some circumstances in which, the system is set up in a certain way, or, a certain team in college only has one receiver, so that receiver picks up all the catches and the yards. But for Xavier, like what you saw the first 4 years was probably not nearly as refined of a player as we're seeing right now. The production obviously was nowhere close to what it is right now, but there were some of those traits. Like he didn't all of a sudden go from 5'8" to 6'2" from last season to this year. But it's a good reminder that you are projecting these players, and you got to dig deeper than just what the stats may tell you. So his breakout is, I'm trying to think of other players. There are a handful of players that probably strike as in that same category of like breakout players this year. Jonah Ellis from Utah has been unbelievable. He's up to 11 and a half sacks, second most in the nation. Dallin Holker is a tight end in Colorado State who was at BYU until recently, kind of went from a unproductive tight end to a finalist for the John Mackey Award, which goes to the best tight end in college football. I mean, there's a handful of guys that have had that same trajectory as Xavier this season, but it certainly you didn't have to, or you don't have to now pound the table as strongly as you did last year if you were a believer in Xavier, because the proof's in the pudding. So I think the guys that come on late, I don't know that necessarily like catapults them up the board faster, but it definitely gives scouts that much more of an argument to make towards their general manager or their head coach about why you should be taking a player like XL.
Yeah, you talk about projections, and I want to obviously get into Spencer Rattler, but another guy I do want to bring up because unfortunately he's been banged up. Xavier Legette has took the torch and he's run with it. Is Juice Wells. And there was obviously a lot of hype about this guy, even coming out of James Madison. And we haven't been able to really see him out there other than that nice flash that he showed during that Georgia game where he scored the touchdown, which unfortunately was the same play he got hurt on. For a guy like that, again, obviously he's going up. And I know you keep saying it's a projection because he's been banged up. I want you to kind of put your agent hat on. I know you're not an agent, but if you were an agent, never mind the fact that you have NIL and everything else now with college football, what do you think would be in the best interest of Juice Wells, without knowing, obviously, from a family standpoint, all that, but in terms of just talking football? And obviously he wants to be drafted as high as possible, and the injury this season certainly will plague that if he decides to go into the draft this year, I'm sure.
There are a lot of factors. Let's start with this, the depth of the class. Right now, if you were to ask me the strongest position in the entire 2024 NFL draft, it's wide receiver. It's not close. There might be 10, 15 guys that go in the first 75 picks. That's how good of a class it is. So you have to ask yourself, I might be one of the most talented guys in the country, but if I'm the 12th receiver off the board, I don't go to pick 71. Is that worth it? Or do I bet on myself, come back for an extra year, make that NIL money, which offsets, the money you're not making in the NFL, and then come back and be maybe the 7th receiver next year in the draft, maybe the 1st receiver in the draft next year. So that's a part of it. I think part of it's your comfort level with a quarterback that's going to be in place next year that's going to replace Spencer Rattler. There's all kinds of sort of components that go into this decision. But it's layered, it's complicated. And I think what I've realized, Mike, in my years of doing this is that, I don't really want to judge these kids on what they decide to do or not to do, because pretty rarely do I have the full story. So I understand both sides of the argument, and I will sort of support the athlete, in almost every case, no matter which way he decides to go.
Well, I'll give you another part of the story, which is a good one, at least for Juice Wells, unless something has changed over the last couple of weeks that I'm not aware of. He is I think he's got the most NIL deals in the SEC. So
is that
not
right?
bad. Yeah. So, and that was prior to the injury. Again, I mean, if someone has surpassed him over the last couple of weeks, he's still one of the top. So point being is, with the NIL money, I mean, he's doing all right. I know that for a fact. Something that's interesting, though, before we get into Spencer, and you could throw Juice Wells in there. I'm sure he would get invited to a Senior Bowl, but because of the change now, starting this year, and I don't know how much you've really thought about this. I think some people might not even know what the heck I'm talking about. Yesterday was announced that they're going to have essentially an upperclassman bowl. Like these games are going to be open to upperclassmen. It's not just going to be limited to seniors. And I bring that up not just specifically about juice, but I think back to 2014, and you'll remember this bowl game. South Carolina people might remember. It doesn't exist anymore. 2014 Medal of Honor Bowl. And a player that stands out to me was Malcolm Butler. To me, and I've had a chance to cover Malcolm in Mississippi. Well, obviously, he's playing New England that year, but he's from Mississippi. I work in Mississippi. Later that following year, we crossed paths, and he told me how much the Medal of Honor Bowl truly helped him be able to show that he can cover SEC talent and whatever. So I bring that up because certainly there's going to be juniors that will come in and have an opportunity to play in these bowl games. So you might have one of those fringe guys like a Malcolm Butler not having an opportunity to play in one of these senior bowls. And I really haven't put my opinion on it, which, I think there's still some good in with it, what they're trying to do. But I bring that up because how much could that impact some of these players, some of these fringe guys? Again, I don't know if that would impact Juice Wells specifically if he were to decide, but it's just one of those things I've been thinking over the last 24 hours since the news came out.
I think what will be interesting is how many of these juniors actually make the decision to declare and jump to one of these all-star games. Because in recent years, what we've seen from the Senior Bowl is while they get some of the best players in the country, you're still getting some of these upper-tier seniors that are choosing not to attend the all-star games because how much more is there for them to prove, right? So I don't know if juniors will take a similar approach. Will a Caleb Williams decide that he needs to go to a bowl game, or will he say, you know what, I'm going to take that extra 7 days and work on my pre-draft prep? I'd like to tell you that I had a good feel for it, but because it's uncharted territory, I don't know what it's going to look like. But it's very fascinating. I have not spoken to either of the directors of the bowl games, the Senior Bowl, the East-West Shrine Game, Jim Nagy or Eric Galko, about how much awareness they had about this decision and whether they had already begun the process of accumulating their potential underclassmen invites. But I'll be fascinated to see if this year is at all emblematic of what it's going to look like in future years, or if this year it's going to be just a handful of juniors / underclassmen, and then next year it's going to explode, where basically it becomes the if you're eligible invitational.
Yeah, just like anything, right? NIL, transfer portal, it's all
brave
uncharted territory. Yeah. And Jim, I think, put a tweet out yesterday saying something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, that, he had a inkling that it could happen. So maybe they started to put a board together of some of those juniors. But again, what does the final roster look like? Before we wrap things up, Spencer Rattler.
Yeah.
Here's a guy that before he arrived at South Carolina, lots made about this Netflix show. And I can tell you, Field, from covering the young man, obviously I was back up in Boston last year with your good friend, Mike Reese, who I'm convinced he is the nicest person in the world. Working with him on Patriots fifth quarter and the pregame show, he's the type of guy that if he had a dog, right, and you ran over his dog, he'd probably find a way to turn around like, well, the dog was old anyway. Like, don't worry about it. Like, nicest guy in the world. But
nicest man ever. Yeah.
Having said all that, between my interactions with Spencer, since I've been back, even before that, he is one of the nicest people that you would ever meet. You talk to players off record and they tell you like, man, like this guy is a leader. He's a tremendous teammate. And then obviously you see the play out there, despite the fact that they've been playing musical chairs up front on the offensive line and he's been getting killed in some of these games. What have you heard just about what Rattler has done from a stock standpoint? I think it was Jim Nagy, speaking about Jim, I think he's put some things out lately over the last couple of weeks saying how impressed he's been with Rattler. But how about yourself?
Leadership's been A+ from Spencer. I mean, he has been as exemplary of a leader for a program as you could be during a season that admittedly has not gone as anybody wanted it to be. I mean, 3-6, 1-5 in the SEC. I'm not, naive to how much that is not sitting well with various Gamecock fans around the area and around the country. But Spencer has been awesome as a leader. He's been so competitive. I think that what it comes down to for Spencer is when you're not one of those first-round quarterbacks, which I do not project Spencer to be. What I think it comes down to is, at some point, once you get past, let's call it the first 45, 50, maybe even 60 picks in the draft, you're not taken as a quarterback. The range from there on out is very dependent upon how you do in the pre-draft process, because that's the chance that teams get to learn about who you are as a human. And it's going to be the intangibles. It's going to be the dependability. It's going to be the interview skills. It's going to be the sharpness on the grease board, so to speak. It's going to be the intellect. It's going to be the processing, the decision making, things that are in some ways studyable, if I can make up a word, on film, but in some ways the kind of things that you learn when you're spending time with an individual. So some teams may say to themselves, hey, we think Spencer Rattler is a third-round pick because he's a developmental number 2 quarterback who could start for us in a pinch. Other teams may say, hey, the size is a concern to us, or whatever it might be. We view him as more like a 5th-round pick. So the range, I imagine, will be pretty wide, depending on which teams you talk to about Spencer during the pre-draft process. But I expect him to be, if not invited, definitely if not attending, definitely invited to one of the All-Star games. And I think he'll have a chance to show some of the natural skills that at one point, early in even in his Oklahoma days, had us wondering whether this could be a future first-round pick.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a fan for sure. There's a lot to like about his game.
And obviously, at the end of the day, it's about production. And I bring that up because when you start to peel back the layers and you're looking at some of the little things, right? And I say little things, they could be bigger things in the eyes of some of these teams. But one thing that really stands out to me is the fact that at least this year, I mean, I know he's been talking about musical chairs. He's gone through so many different OCs between going from Oklahoma to South Carolina, Marcus Satterfield last year at OC. And now he has Dal Loggins, a guy that has plenty of experience of coaching in the NFL as an offensive coordinator.
That matters.
And Dal mentioned yesterday just some of the things he's been working on with Spencer. And it's not just what's going on the field, but how you talk to the media, just little things like that. How much can that help sometimes? The fact that he's been working, he's had a chance to work with an NFL OC. Again, obviously, can you get the job done? Can the production be there? I'm sure is the most important thing. But again, peeling back those layers, having the opportunity to work with an NFL OC, can that only help him?
Totally. Yeah, the reality for a quarterback is whether especially when you're the starter, but in general, you're a CEO of the company. And so when you've got people that are shining the light bright on you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it's not just how you play on the field. Is how do you comport yourself off the field? How do you handle yourself publicly? What do you do in times of adversity? What do you do when perhaps others aren't doing their job at a satisfactory level? Do you point fingers? Do you point the thumb? What do you do? How do you handle yourself? So I think that the experience with Dowell this year will end up being valuable for Spencer, who I just think he's going to end up being one of those players that no matter where he gets drafted, he'll start a few games at some point in his career. And we're going to say, oh, yeah, I remember that kid. I remember why he was so highly touted at one point during his college career. So I'm a fan. And if you're a team that is looking for a number 2 quarterback in this year's draft, I think that Spencer Rattler certainly fits the bill.
And Field, I'll leave you with this. I don't know how familiar you are with Debo Williams on defense, but I think he could be a steal. I mean, I think back a couple of years ago, I don't want to compare players, but I remember when Ernest Jones was coming out and he went under the radar, and it feels like, I know he wasn't active last week for the Rams, but I think outside of last week and then one other game this season, he's led the Rams in tackles every friggin' week.
Been awesome.
Helped them in the Super Bowl year.
I'm a fan of some of the guys on defense. I think that TJ Sanders, we'll see if he declares or not, but if he does, he will not have to wait long for his name to be called, because that guy is all sorts of freaky and long and disruptive and a real terror to block on the interior of that defensive line.
Well, Field, appreciate you hopping on today. Gamecock fans, check them out. Fantasy Focus. I mean, you're on so many friggin' shows now. I can't even keep up anymore, man. I'm very happy for you.
Thank you, Mike. Right back to you, my friend. I appreciate your loyalty and your trust for all these years. A decade plus. We were getting old, man. Let's try to pull a little Benjamin Button, age in reverse here going forward.
You say that, and the hair, and I know you get this a good bit. I mean, the hair, what's the secret, though? I mean, I wish I
was going to say, you got good layers. Sweet. I don't.
It's going back a little bit, though. It just starts to go back. Just like one of our coworkers, Wes Mitchell. I don't know if he's on listening. You two. The hairline just doesn't go back.
Yeah, I honestly, I wish there was more of a secret other than I go to the barber a lot.
Hey, you know what? You deserve it, though. Field
My
Yates
20
again.
minutes of peace and quiet during the week.
Hey, before I let you go, one of your colleagues is actually going to be joining us next week. At least we've been texting about it. She hasn't officially said it's going to work, but Alyssa Lang. You've had a chance to be able to work with Alyssa, and this fan base, they love Alyssa. And Alyssa's actually, I don't know if you know this, she actually used to work for Gamecock Central back in the day.
Yeah, Alyssa, of course, a proud SC grad, the GOAT, the best. Love Alyssa. She's absolutely incredible. She's great at her job. She loves football, obsessed with all sports, really. She's great. Her soon-to-be husband, Trevor, is one of my good buddies as well. They are an awesome, awesome, awesome family. Yeah, so I'm glad you did this week. And tell her this, because if you had Alyssa on prior to me, I would just say no thanks, Mike, because that's a tough act to follow right there.
Well, it worked out. It worked out. Appreciate you hopping on this week. And again, listen to Field Yates when it comes. There was so many of them. I didn't start putting them up. People started asking. I knew it was going to happen. But Field, appreciate you hopping on, man.
Sounds good, bud. Talk to you soon.
All right. Once again, Field Yates of ESPN joining us today, giving some insight as far as some of the South Carolina guys are concerned. Also mentioned TJ Sanders. And as Field said, I mean, we'll figure out whether or not Sanders declares. And JP says, keep Sanders on the down low. We need him next year. Yeah. I think some people heard him say Sanders, like, man, we can't afford to lose him when you're talking about trying to build those trenches up. Certainly South Carolina has a lot of talented guys on the offensive line. You don't even count a guy like Marquis Anderson because he hasn't had the opportunity to play this year because of the injury that he's been facing. But you think about just the talent they already have, the experience they've been able to gain already on that O-line, despite obviously the circumstances being the way they are as to why those guys have had to go in. But I also think, too, some of the guys that South Carolina are going to be adding to that offensive line for next season. So, that's next year. Wanted to talk about this, though, with Field because, again, saw that tweet a couple weeks ago, him praising Xavier Legette, got me thinking, you know what? Let's have Field on because with 3 games to go still, at least 3 games to go. If you want to stay optimistic, possibility of a bowl game, but with at least 3 games to go, there's a tremendous opportunity for some of these players to continue to raise that bar up and have their stock go up. And certainly the things that Xavier Legette has done this year, it has grabbed the attention of the national people. I mean, you heard Field right now just talk about it. It's not just the thing. It's not just the secret anymore in Columbia how good X is. You have guys like Field Yates, Jim Nagy, who does a tremendous job with the Reese's Senior Bowl. You have guys like that are like, man, this kid is special. And talk about the Reese's Senior Bowl. Reese's Senior Bowl actually named Legette the co-national offensive player of the week last week. That's the award I was talking about after putting up over 200 yards receiving. 2 touchdowns, just phenomenal. And again, Legette just needs 27 yards receiving to become the 5th Gamecock in program history to eclipse the 1,000-yard receiving mark in a season. It's only happened 5 times. This will be the 6th time because Sidney Rice did it twice, but he would join a very, very elite class. Alshon Jeffrey holding that top spot. I don't need to tell you how good Alshon was. Sterling Sharp. Don't need to tell you how good Sterling was. I mean, shoot, those 2 players alone, their jerseys are retired at South Carolina. And on top of that, Pharaoh Cooper, don't need to tell you how good he was. Sidney Rice did it twice. And I wasn't even trying to rhyme. Know how good he was as well. Marion, R26 says Sanders has only been a starter 1 year. He should come back to help his stock. I agree. I think it can help him out tremendously. I mean, you look at what South Carolina has produced from a defensive standpoint. Shoot, I got here in 2016. I know it goes back even before that. But let's just look at that time period, right? Just look at between 2016 to now. The number of defensive players that have come out of South Carolina during that time period. Defensive players that have just been ballers at the next level. Again, you go back before that, obviously it speaks for itself, right? Because now you start getting into 2014, 13, 12. Now you're talking about guys like Clowney, Gilmore, Ingram. I mean, we can keep going down the list. The talent that came out during that time period speaks for itself. But even since then, 2016 to now, mention Ernest Jones. Obviously, he has played out of his freaking mind. Hopefully he's going to be healthy enough to be able to play this weekend. I'd be lying to you if I said I paid attention to the injury report for the Rams. Could check that out. Sunday mornings, the injury update, as well as guys who are on the practice squad, all that stuff. We put that out for you every Sunday morning, as well as kickoff times and what channel those games are. So you can follow every Gamecock in the NFL. But a lot of good stuff from Field there. A lot of good stuff from Field. And I think the big thing, too, we talked about Spencer Rattler, and you heard it from him, from talking to these scouts, talking to these teams. The fact of the matter is that narrative that was painted about him because of a Netflix series when he was friggin' in high school, for crying out loud. I know that it won't be gone completely, and I'm sure Spencer is fortunate enough to get invited to the NFL Combine, or even if he's not, and he has meetings with these NFL teams, scouts, whatever the case may be, I'm sure that will get brought up. I mean, stuff like that gets brought up during the interview process when teams are meeting with you. But the reason I bring that up is because having the opportunity to hear Field say, yeah, people are talking about his leadership ability. Like, it's showing. Like, people are taking notice to it on a national level, and scouts are paying attention to it. Teams are paying attention to it. It's not just the South Carolina media that's talking about it anymore. And I'm sure many of you who have had the opportunity to not just see, obviously, what Spencer does in the field, but some of the events that he's been part of, some of the Gamecock Central events, some of the interviews he's done with GC on 107.5 The Game, and some of the Garnet Trust interviews he's done. He's just a good person. He really is. And I think a lot of you, outside of the fact that he is helping your football team the best he can, despite some of the circumstances with the offense this year, and not just the offense, we can talk about defense too, that he goes out there and he competes his butt off. And a lot of you are pulling for him, certainly, but going to be interested to see where things go for him. Another guy, though, that we talked about was Juice Wells. Not apples to apples. We talk about a guy like Sanders, but I truly believe Juice would be in a better spot if he were to come back next year. Outside of the fact, and we got into the conversation with Field about it, outside of the fact that you have the chance to make up some of that money in the short term through NIL opportunities, which he's making plenty of right now, you also have the opportunity to come back and write the narrative that you're looking to be able to create, the narrative that you wanted to continue this season that you weren't able to because of an early season injury. I think about that because you look at a guy like Xavier Legette, who, yeah, the size, the speed, that's always been there. And certainly he got bigger and faster over time. And I don't want to make it seem like as soon as he came out of Mullins, he was looking as yoked as he is right now. Put a lot of work in over the last couple of years, had an opportunity to have that fifth year. But I bring that up because you think of a guy like Xavier Legette and how much he's been able to raise his draft stock this year, just in 1 year. 1 year. And as Field said, what goes into these decisions, it's not just about the production that you have on the field. It's a projection. And you're trying to project how good a player is going to be at the next level. Now, certainly, if you are riding this high and you have this nice wave that you're on because you've been able to do a lot of great things your senior year, your last season of college football, yeah, that can help you out a lot. No question about that. Now, is that always the case? Certainly not. I mean, we can look at examples across the board, not just South Carolina, but guys who have tremendous college careers or even a good senior year, but they're not going to be NFL guys, or they're not the type of player that is going to warrant the same type of attention in comparison to some of the guys that we're talking about right here. So I bring that up because I think with Juice, if Juice were to go into the NFL draft this year, whether or not we see Juice for the rest of the season, which I still believe we will, especially if South Carolina wins this weekend, I could certainly see him back for the Clemson game if they beat Kentucky. But having said all of that, I think the big thing with Juice is you have to ask yourself, what is my ultimate goal? Well, shoot, I'm sure his ultimate goal is to be able to play in the NFL, right? But not just to make it to the NFL and not to discredit anybody who's had the opportunity to get invited to a camp or had an opportunity to work out with a team. But it's not just to get to the NFL. It's to get to the NFL and be great. Put yourself in the best position to succeed so that not only do you have a tremendous NFL career from a production standpoint, but that production will hopefully lead to good amount of wealth for you and your family so that you can take care of yourself and your family. Certainly having the college career that he's had, not even last season at USC, but going back to his days at James Madison, this guy can ball. I mean, if you remember when Juice Wells committed to South Carolina, the text message I shared with you guys on Gamecock Central from one of the coaches who had a game plan against this guy. And I don't have it in front of me right now. I'm paraphrasing, but what he said was he's the type of guy that on third down, everyone in the building knows the ball's going to go to him. Everyone in the stands, everyone on the field, all the coaches, everyone knows the ball's going to go to him. He knows that everyone knows that too. And he doesn't shrink in the spotlight. He only gets bigger. And he always comes through. So I say that because, unfortunately, that was taken away from us this year. That was taken away from Juice in being able to see him do those things that he's been doing throughout his entire career, even going back to his days in high school, even in prep school. So I think, look, when you talk about projections, as Field alluded to, I think if we were just talking about, okay, if you had a guess, how do you think things would turn out for Juice if he decided to go to the NFL? I think a lot of us would probably say, yeah, he'd probably do pretty good. Just based off of, again, if we're just trying to project. However, there's a difference between saying that in comparison to, man, if he comes back and he were to ball out, he could really help his draft stock out. And certainly if he's getting drafted higher than where he might go if he were to go to the NFL draft this year, I think it would go without saying that a lot of people expect him to have a good NFL career, right? If he's getting drafted higher in comparison, I'm not saying that whatever his draft stock would be if he doesn't choose to come back this season, enters the draft after the season, it wouldn't still be decent. But if he comes back next year, balls out, has the type of year that Xavier Legette's putting up, which obviously is going to be difficult because you're losing Spencer Rattler. You're going to have a new quarterback back there, whether that be Lenore Sellers, Luke Doty gets an opportunity, Dante Irmo comes in, whatever the case may be, things are going to be a little different back there. But having said all that, you got to ask yourself what's in the best interest of you. And while I can sit here and say I think it would be in his best interest to come back, because I think not only would it help his draft stock out to be able to climb in comparison to where it will probably be after this season if he doesn't come back at all, or even if he does come back in one game, he has the opportunity to be able to make a lot of money through NIL. A lot of money through NIL. He's doing a heck of a job right now, and everything that he's earning, he's earned it. Hasn't just been given to him. He's earned it with his play. It's a shame that, unfortunately, he's been banged up and hasn't been able to go out there and be the Juice Wells that we all know him to be outside of that little flash against Georgia. But hopefully we'll be able to see him at some point this season. But again, Field Yates does a phenomenal job. Goes without saying. So many of you, I'm sure, knew exactly who he was when he came on. I'm very grateful that he took the time because, as I alluded to during the interview with him, I mean, he's on I can't even keep up with the number of shows that he does. Fantasy football, all the NFL shows that he does. I mean, he's all over the place. And he's one of the best at what he does. And he's a very, very, very good person. And as you heard him say, he's glad that he hopped on this week because Alyssa Lang will be joining us next week. We'll get a confirmation on that. But I believe Alyssa said that she should be good to go for next Thursday. So we'll have Alyssa Lang on, talk about the Gamecocks, and hopefully a Gamecock team that will be getting ready to play a Kentucky team who, with the win against the Wildcats, brings you to 5-6 heading into that Clemson game. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much, right? Got to win this weekend. Got to beat Kentucky. But man, 5-6 against Clemson, regardless of what happens with Clemson the rest of the way, that place would be pretty electric, regardless of what the kickoff time would be. I know many Gamecock fans would love to see that game be at night if South Carolina wins these next two. But we'll worry about that if we get there. All right, let's get into questions. Appreciate you guys waiting. David says, are we getting any players back from injury, especially on the defensive side of the ball? Well, what we know of right now, David, as we do this show right now it's a little before 3 o'clock on Thursday. So depending on when you're listening to this show, because you can go back, watch it on YouTube. You can go back, listen to it on the Gamecock Central Podcast Network. But depending on when you're listening to this, a little before 3 right now on Thursday, Shane Beamer will talk tonight at Carolina Calls. That's at 6. He might have some updates on some players. As far as right now, again, as of right now, the guys that we know that are out for sure, offensive lineman Trey Jones, he's out. Running back to Kerryon Joyner, he's out. And then Trey Knox is questionable. He is questionable this weekend. Defensively, I mean, look, I feel like the guys that have been banged up, I think pretty much they have everyone that you would expect to play this weekend. So I don't think there's any mysteries from a defensive standpoint, David. If I'm missing someone, I apologize. I can't think of anyone that comes to mind. So if you can think of a name or two, let me know, and I'll double check for you as before we wrap things up. But I think South Carolina is in pretty good shape defensively, all things considered. And I say all things considered, guys are banged up at this time of the year, but I don't believe there's anything major that would catch anyone by surprise this week. And David also asked, secondly, do you see any freshmen to play additional snaps without burning a scholarship for Vandy? So the interesting thing about things now is that we have 3 games to go, right? Now, some players did see some time last week. A guy like DJ Braswell saw some time out there. You had Braswell play earlier in the year against Furman, and there were a bunch of players that played against Furman that were true freshmen that haven't really played at all this year. So I bring that up because when you look at the fact that you have 3 games to go, there's some guys on this team that have only played in 1 game because you've been trying to do what you can to preserve their red shirt. A guy that I know a lot of fans would like to see a little bit more of, and I've made the argument before, and we said this even before the start of the season, I think it'd be really dumb to use Lenore Sellers in some of these packages to just throw him out there to do a couple QB sneaks, 4 plays a game, or whatever the case may be. So while USC chose not to do that, now you have the ability to do that. And the reason I specifically bring that up, the fact that Kerryon Joyner is out this weekend, Kerryon has been an absolute monster in the red zone, especially when they have the ball inside the 10, inside the 5-yard line. He's a guy that they love going to. We've seen him also featured in some Wildcat packages, but it hasn't just been Wildcat. We've had Spencer out there. It's been like a pistol formation. You've seen just your basic shotgun. You've seen Rattler under center, handing the ball off to DK. So they've come out with multiple packages and they've got him the ball, and he's been able to find the end zone. I bring that up because you don't have that at your disposal this weekend because DK's out. So what better timing than to have Sellers get out there and play a little bit more in those red zone situations. Because with his body, the size, the speed, he can throw the football. I think, to me, I'm just going to be honest here, what a critique that I would have, just because I haven't been able to see it as much. And he could be doing a really nice job of it in practice. We just don't see it. But going back to camp, which, again, it's unfair to bring some of these things up, but we just, as the media, they don't allow, it's not like the NFL. They don't allow you to go to practice and observe practice for a little bit. But going back to summer camp, just those touch passes, those little touch passes. We know the guy has a cannon for an arm, but just those little touch passes that sometimes, as a young quarterback, as simple as it looks on TV, right? Could be a 5-yard pass to the outside, just a little screen or swing pass, or even in the red zone. Some of those passes that look easy to make, those sometimes are the toughest. So I want to assume that he's got better with that. And if he has, that gives you an extra wrinkle when you throw him out there, if they throw him out there. I think we'll see Sellers this weekend. I really do. How much we see of him, that's still to be seen. But the only thing that I have a problem with, and it's not even about the fact that it's Sellers or anybody, Rattler has given you the opportunity to do a lot this year. And knowing the fact of how banged up that offensive line is, he knows better than anyone. He knows better than anyone. Yes, Sellers can run. I get all that. I get that. But there's certain things, because of the experience factor that Rattler has, that, to me, if I'm a coach, I feel more comfortable with, and I don't want to take off my best player from the field. That doesn't mean you can't insert Sellers at times, but I wouldn't go crazy just throwing him in for the sake of throwing him in there. Again, red zone situations, short yarded situations, I can see that. Especially, again, knowing that you don't have DK this weekend, and if Sellers plays the rest of the season, he's not going to burn a redshirt year. That's at your disposal. And, oh, by the way, you do something this weekend, and let's say DK's back for the Kentucky game, or DK's back against Clemson. And I'll say this about DK. I think there was a photo that he uploaded. I think someone took a photo with him and he uploaded it, or vice versa. He was in a walking boot. So I don't know the severity of the injury quite yet. Sometimes it's just a precaution to put him in a walking boot. But as we all know, you look at that could be the rest of the year. That could just be one game. You don't know. We don't know. And everyone obviously heals differently. But I bring that up because regardless of DK's status for the rest of the season, or even next week, that's just something extra teams are going to have to prepare for. You throw Sellers out there, you give him that look, just like we've talked about before, to Kerryon Joyner out there running the Wildcat. Yeah, he's done it before in the past, but we hadn't seen it this year. Something extra that teams have to prepare against. You throw Lenoris out there, man, that's something extra they have to prepare for. And those extra couple minutes preparing for that look, sometimes that can take away from time that they're spending on their special teams, or they're spending on their own offense, because they have to put more time in to prepare for X amount of looks that you're throwing at them. So I think this would be a great time for USC to get Sellers out there. Gavin says, I feel like if we are healthy on the O-line, they won't be able to keep up with Rattler and company. I really feel good about the offense this week. Again, I mentioned that Vandy, second in the SEC in takeaways. But if the defense does their job, and forces some turnovers, and I know there's a lot of ifs, right? But if they can do that, and if special teams, who I feel like when you're talking about a complete game on special teams, every unit, I still feel like we're still looking for that game out of them this year. If they can play a clean game, which they've been close to. They've been close. Some boneheaded penalties these last 2 weeks with a kick-catch interference. 2 missed opportunities, at least 2 to me, where they had opportunities to block a punt. They also missed out on an opportunity to down a ball inside the 10. Honestly, it would have been inside the 5. And yet Kai Kroger still ranks 32nd in the country when it comes to net punting. And certainly that's not just on Kai. That's for the entire punt team. how you cover it, penalties, all that kind of stuff gets calculated into the mix. But Kai, despite the inconsistencies at time, he's still giving you a good chance to be able to flip the field. Is it the Kai that we have known him to be? No. But I also think, too, what gets overlooked is some of these boneheaded things that are happening on special teams. And that doesn't help Kai. So it's not just the Kai thing. What else we got? Talked about this with JP earlier. Rushed for more than 100 yards. They certainly looked like they were on their way to do that last week with Mario Anderson. I think Mario had 43 yards. He had over 40 yards in his first 2 carries. I think it was 40 yards actually on one run in particular. And then after that, give credit to Jacksonville State. Threw an extra guy down in the box, and USC just had no answer when it came to running the football. And yes, I understand Spencer Rattler picked Jacksonville State's defense apart. But at the same time, too, there were times that USC wanted to run the football. They wanted to run the football, and they couldn't. That's frustrating. It's frustrating. I don't care what you're doing through the air. When you want to be able to run the football and you can't run the ball because you're not getting that push up front that you need to be able to do those things, what other word is there to use other than just frustrated? It was a very frustrating day for USC outside of that opening drive when it came to running the football. Have to get back to running the football this week, and no question about it. No question. David also says, interesting point regarding the Lembo coaching tree at Vandy. Thanks for pointing that out. Hadn't realized that. Yeah, if you just joined us, I mentioned a little bit earlier on the program before ESPN's Field Yates hopped on that there are 3 coaches on Vandy's staff that once upon a time coached under Pete Lembo. And the special teams coordinator for Vandy is actually one of those guys. I want to go back to this question by David, though, because I mentioned Lenoris, but there could be some other players here. Want to show this. Where is it? So Jalen Kilgore, Nicholas Harbor, Judge Collier, Desmond Umeozulu. Those freshmen right there, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those 4 true freshmen, they've played in every game this season for South Carolina. Every game. Luedecke Babalade, a.k.a. Big Tree. He's played in 8 games this season. Pup Howard, he's played in 8 games. Javon Baugh, he's played in 8 games. Tyshawn Russell, he's played in 7 games. Once you get under that, now you're approaching a territory where there's players that are getting close to going over that mark of playing in games where they can burn a year of redshirting. Connor Cox, he's played in 3 games. Furman, Texas A&M, and then against Jacksonville State. Played 9 snaps this past weekend. And some of that had to do with the fact that Trey Knox has been banged up. DJ Braswell, he's appeared in 2 games. Bakari Swain, he's appeared in 3 games. Hasn't appeared, though, since the Georgia game. Kelton Henderson, 2 games. Sabari Sandy, 2 games. Lenore Sellers, 1. Jatavius Shivers, 1. Elijah Caldwell, CJ Adams, Cam Sandler, Reed Kiska, Marquis Anderson, of course, out for the season, but all those guys have not appeared. And then Xavier McLeod dismissed from the team. So I bring that up just to give you guys a better idea as to who you might see this weekend. If Trey Knox isn't able to go, I wouldn't be shocked to see Connor Cox get an opportunity to play this weekend, simply because you have to do what's in the best interest of the team. I think they want to do everything they can to preserve his year of eligibility. But you also have to ask yourself, man, we need to be able to find a way to win. We have to find a way to win these games, especially if South Carolina wants to be bowl eligible and they need X amount of guys to play, this position and that position. So wouldn't be shocked to see Connor Cox out there. Let's see. What else we got here? Gavin says, I feel like if we are healthy. Oh, yep. We went through that already. Jamie says, if we had any type of O-line, Spencer is a first-round guy. Hot take, Rattler is a better pro than Williams, being Caleb Williams. JP says, keep Sanders on the down low. Yep, mentioned that a little bit earlier. Pimp on a blimp, 89. Good to have you back on here. Says, so what are the odds that Landon Sampson transfers? Well, I think how things go this offseason as far as when you have that end of the year meeting with Landon, with not just his positional coach, but you're talking about Beamer as well. You're talking about Dal Loggins and that positional coach, of course, being Justin Stepp. You find out now, okay, this is the plan we have for you moving forward. What are your expectations? And this isn't just limited to Landon, but it comes down to sometimes trying to figure out what is the plan for a player. What are the expectations? And we're not there every day. I can just tell you the biggest thing that he needed to do based on the conversations I had people close to the program heading into camp. And I understand there were some things that he faced outside of football that grabbed his attention. But his issue, at least heading into this camp, was continuing to stack good days on top of good days. He was doing a lot of good things during camp, but it was, can you continue to do that day after day after day to a level that we need you to be able to do it at? So, again, I bring that up not to say that's been the issue as to why he hasn't been playing, but that's one thing that at least heading into the year was brought to my attention. Because I still think Landon can do some really good things here. Really good things. I know his family enjoys the area. I think they built a place not too far from the stadium. I would love to see Landon have an opportunity to showcase his talents at some point this year. It'd be great if South Carolina was in a blowout and you get to see him play a little bit this weekend or, whatever the case may be. Could be a bowl game. Who knows? South Carolina goes to a bowl game depending on who's playing, who's not. But I bring all that up because I still think it's premature to start looking at that and saying he'll do that. And I'm not picking on you, Pimp on a Blimp 89. But I just think you got to look at the numbers too. How many receivers are back? Where does he factor in? I mean, yes, sure. There's some freshmen that have leapfrogged him on the depth chart this year, and they would have a leg up heading into next year based on that. But how far off really is he? And those conversations typically take place at the end of the year. Pimp on a Blimp again says, and what about the wide receiver that has committed to App State? I might be missing something on that one, Pimp on a Blimp, so I can't really talk about that because not super familiar with that. Gamecock 420 says, go Gamecocks. Marion R26 says, Juice needs to come back to show the scouts he can still play, and the injury has not slowed him down. I agree. And it's, again, even if Juice does come back for one game this year or whatever the case may be, two if there's a bowl game, I still think being able to put a whole body's worth of work in can go a hell of a lot further, especially if he's trying to get up to a point where he feels like he deserves to be drafted here or there. You heard from Field Yates just talking about how deep this wide receiver class is. He's put himself behind the eight ball a little bit, unfortunately. And that's not to say he wouldn't get drafted. I don't want to seem like I'm going that far off the grid by saying like, all right, yeah, no shot now. No. But certainly not having a chance to showcase your talents for a year hurts things a little bit. I'm going to go back to Jay Diz. Diz says, just like what Juice did to steal the Clemson game, dude is clutch. David again says, how cool would it be if USC has back to back 1,000 receivers. Xavier this year, Juice next year, and Nick in 25. Well, it'd be great. I'll tell you what, and many people would say this, right? They would just be happy if Juice comes back, even if Juice doesn't eclipse the 1,000-yard mark. He was close last year. Get the exact total for you. I believe Juice had 900 something receiving yards. What was it? Juice Wells had 928. That is the 8th most in program history. Ahead of him, we've mentioned Alshon Jeffrey, right? Because he has the record at 1,517. Sidney Rice, Pharaoh Cooper, Sterling Sharp, Sidney Rice again, 2006, that 2005 season is what put Sidney at number 2. Number 6 right now is Xavier Legette. So it hasn't been updated quite yet. So I might have to make a little adjustment here if I said Wells was 8th, because now everyone gets bumped down one. But Legette at 6. Pharaoh Cooper again, his 2015 season, 7th. The 8th most yards receiving in a season, 2007, the late Kenny McKinley. And then 9th, Juice Wells. Heading into the year, Juice Wells, the 8th most yards receiving in a season. In Gamecock history, bumped down now because of the season Legette has had, as he has leapfrogged him and also leapfrogged McKinley and at least Pharaoh Cooper's 2015 campaign. But Juice Wells, 928 yards receiving last season. I say all that because even if Juice did that and he just came back, man, people would say, sign me up. But having said that, you also threw in Nick Harbor. Gamecock fans would love that. They would love that. I mean, that's the other thing, too. We don't know what the quarterback situation will look like next year. Even if, when I mean by that is, let's say Sellers is the starter. I'm talking about how consistent is he? What is he able to give you? Certainly, he's been able to show you that he has talent, but what does that look like? We've seen this year, there's been things, unfortunately, that Spencer Rattler hasn't been able to control because of the offensive line. And the fact that at the beginning of the season, they weren't getting the consistency they needed out of the running back room. So it put more on him. And while he has plenty of experience, he still took a beating at times. You know, one of my favorite quotes, I think I've said this before in this program. If not, I've said it on other GC Live shows. Mike Tyson, everyone has a game plan until you get punched in the face. I think Sellers is going to do some amazing things here. But I also think, just like with any young player, simmer down with expectations a little bit at times, just because we don't know what that is just going to look like next year with the offensive line. Because again, it's not just about what Sellers can do when he has time, when guys do get open. It's what happens when he has to make some things happen. And I think he's going to still do some amazing things. But I bring that up because let's say they're able to get some things going with Sellers or whoever the starting quarterback is next year. You have Nick Harbor on one side. You have Juice Wells on the other. Throw in the other guys in there too. Tyson Russell. Omega Blake's going to start getting better over time. Some of these younger receivers that haven't really been playing as much. I bring that up because imagine what that looks like now for a guy like Juice. Juice does some good things, comes back, right? Teams want to start double teaming him. Nick Harbor's open. Don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but man, just thinking about that a little bit. Trey Daniels says, sloppy, rainy game could be an opportunity to use Sellers. Just got to be smart with the ball regardless, right? Got to be smart with the football, protect it, whether it's Sellers, whether it's Mario Anderson. Of course, he'll get touches, but a guy like DJ Braswell could be used a little bit more. Braswell could see some more action this weekend, especially if Joyner's out. Juju McDowell could see him get used more this weekend. Got used a good bit last weekend. Travis Edwards says, Mike, should Beamer announce Juice Wells should be back after this game, even if he doesn't play, just to give UK something else to game plan for? No, I wouldn't say that. And the reason why I say that, Travis, is, and I think he's tried to do that without saying that directly. And I think the reason why is he goes out and he says, all right, hey, Juice Wells is going to be back this week, and he doesn't play. Never mind the backlash he's going to receive as a coach. But it's like, okay, is that because of what Beamer said, or is it because Juice doesn't want to play? And then you have to deal with a popsicle headache. So from a gamesmanship standpoint, I understand wanting to get that narrative out there so that Kentucky has to deal with an extra body to prepare against for. Certainly a guy who is a stud when he's healthy. But I think you go about it the way that he has. And I know some fans are sick and tired of hearing it. But to me, and this is the way that I'm taking everything away, based on some of the conversations I've had with people close to the program, Juice is in a good spot to return at some point this season if he chooses to. It's not just from a physical standpoint of can he do it? Because I think, honestly, if he had to play this weekend, I think he could. Again, based on some of the things I've been told. But you're also trying to look out for what's in the best interest of yourself long-term wise. And if you push through and you try to come back a little bit earlier, just like with any injury, the probability of that occurring again, it goes up. You know, not to do story time in college, I broke my hand. Doctor told me, hey, you can get back out there in whatever, X amount of weeks. And I said, well, I want to get back out on the field like now. So I went back out, I think 4 days later with a broken hand. And what they did was they double layered it. They double layered the cast. And by double layering it, I had to wear it for an extra 2 weeks in comparison to wearing it for, I think, 6. I wore it for 8. So I say that because there's always a risk when you try to come back. And the risk was when I went back with my broken hand, doctor said, hey, look, the possibility of you either breaking this thing or it not healing properly, it shoots up to, I think it was like 50%. And I'm not a doctor. There could be someone on here saying like, that's not true. It was around there. Okay. I mean, this has been over a decade. So throw me a bone. But the point being is Juice has to ask himself, is it worth it? And it's not just from a physical standpoint. We talked about this with so many players when it comes to ACLs, foot injuries too, right? Luke Doty. The mental hurdles sometimes a player has to overcome, that can be even greater than the physical challenges that an injury throws your way. Because when you go out there, especially with a lower body injury, whether it be a knee, whether it be a foot, whether it be ankle, lower body injury, because of so much that you're demanding from your body with the cutting and changing of directions, jumping, speed, all those things, right? Every step you take, you have to reprogram your brain. You have to reprogram your brain not to think about those things, not to think about, man, I'm making that cut off that foot. I haven't done that in X amount of weeks, or I haven't done that and got hit in a game. Never mind get hit in practice. So I think it's a mental challenge too for Juice, and not just for Juice, but any player that comes back from a lower body injury. Jay Diz says, let's give Braswell some more run. Don't want it to be all on Mario. He looked pretty banged up last week, and we need Super Mario, 1,000%. And he said, you think you said 100, but I'll throw 1,000% for UK and Kentucky. Travis Edwards says, the running backs did rush for more than 100. Spencer's sacks took us below 100. Let me see here. I believe they had maybe like 111 was the number of rushing yards last week. And then those sack yardage, like you said, it takes it away. But the reason I bring that up is because even if they did run for over 100 yards last week, which I think they ran again. I think they ran for 111 when it's the sack adjustment statistic, where if the sack yardage, because sack yardage takes away from your rushing total. But I bring that up because, again, 40 of those yards came on one play. That was actually on the opening drive. May have been the second or third play of the game. Mario Anderson's run. And outside of that, you weren't able to do anything in the run game. Anything. You had a nice big run. You had a nice explosive. But you weren't able to do anything after that. And that was the part that got frustrating, when you can't run the football when you wanted to run it. And that certainly was the case for South Carolina when you went back and looked at the film of what they weren't able to do. Yeah, I have it right here. Here it is. While Spencer Rattler was able to pick apart JSU's defense for 399 yards through the air, it was evident that when South Carolina wanted to run the football, they couldn't. And you guys can see this story that I wrote up this past week, grading South Carolina's keys of the game. USC's sack adjustment rushing yards was 111. But as I mentioned, the majority of those yards came on South Carolina's first drive, in large part to Anderson's 40-yard run on USC's third offensive play. After that, we'll use Anderson for an example, since he's the starting running back, and he had 43 yards on that from those first two carries, 40 on that one run in particular. After that, on 14 carries, Anderson just had 32 yards. 32 yards on 14 carries after those first two to start the game. Charles goes, Mike, are we in danger of losing Josiah Thompson? I'd be lying to you, Charles, if I said that I've been paying super close attention to that. So if that has been on the message board, I haven't seen that. I'm not saying that it hasn't been the case, but that would be news to me. Travis Hill says, Mike, why do you think our perimeter blocking is so bad by our receivers? Is it technique or a strength issue? We are just unable to get guys like Brown, Legette, or Harbor on the outside when we do jet plays. The thing about it, and Travis, I'm glad you brought it up, because at the beginning of the year, there were times, and going back to last year, I would specifically point out the job that South Carolina was doing on the perimeter. They were doing an outstanding job with their stock blocking, their perimeter blocking. That's something that I know that Justin Stepp spends a lot of time preaching, teaching. He is very prideful when it comes to that stuff. So I think more than anything, it's a want thing. It's a want. Receivers have to want to do it. And when you have so many young receivers, and that's not to say that they don't care. I look at a guy like Nicholas Harbor, even going back to week 1 against North Carolina, where he didn't have, I think, any targets, but he was showing effort with the way that he was running to try to help with blocking. I think some of it can be a technique thing with these younger guys, but again, it's being coached up in practice, because Stepp spends a lot of time on stock blocking, a lot of time. He's one of those receivers coaches that, again, like I mentioned, takes tremendous pride with blocking on the perimeter. So maybe for some of these younger guys, they haven't really been asked to do that going back to their high school days, or maybe it just wasn't something that was coached up on as much. Some of these guys, I'm sure, some of these guys played at some pretty good high schools, and I'm sure it got coached up, but how much was it coached up? Just the little things. Plus, you're going up against SEC caliber players now. So it's a combination of want, and it's a combination of just executing. There's periods, and I know this, that South Carolina does this. Every team in the country does it. Going back to my college days, Division II, where you do during an indie period. And an indie period is an individual period. Typically, the defensive backs go with the defensive backs, receivers go with the receivers. Sometimes, though, you do a combined indie period. You might have the receivers working with the defensive backs. And one of those periods that you'll be working on during an indie period is block destruction if you're a defensive back, or in this case, on the flip side of it, perimeter blocking. So you're spending a lot of time doing stuff like that, and you're getting good reps. It's not just practicing the shadow drill. If you guys remember back to your high school days, right? Put your hands behind your back and you're kind of just shadowing, kind of like in basketball. Probably remember the shadow drill in basketball. But there's stuff like that, but you're actually getting good work in practice, good on good. So again, I think it just comes down to technique and just the desire to want to do it. That want to do it. The ball's not coming your way. And I'm not saying this specifically about any player in particular, but ball's not coming your way in a game. Are you still going to be able to give the team that same effort that you need to be able to do what you got to do in the perimeter to help spark that run, to spring that run to that next level, to be able to create an explosive? David says sloppy. Yeah, sloppy weather on Saturday. Got to protect that football. Robert says, could the team, after all that's happened, make this a great year? I want to be excited. They could, Robert. Still on the table. Bottom line is you got to win this weekend, right? You win this weekend. You win next weekend. Heading into that Clemson game at 5-6, I would argue that game itself would be bigger than whatever bowl game South Carolina would go to. I mean, I'm praying that if they go to a bowl game, it's not like Shreveport or anything, but bigger picture, when you take a step back, and I know fans want to go to a nice play, I get all that, but when you take a step back and you just look at it from what's in the best interest for the team, being able to have 15 extra practices would be massive. I'm not here to say that Spencer Rattler wouldn't play in that bowl game, but just, again, hypothetically speaking, he doesn't play in the bowl game. You're able to get Lenore Sellers some extra reps. Not only that, but Dante Reno has told me, at least the plan has been, like Pup Howard last year, he would start to practice with the team. He'd start to practice with the team. Can't play in the bowl game, but you can start to practice with the team. And when you look at what that quarterback room is going to look like next year, Luke Doty, Dante Reno, Tanner Bailey, Lenore Sellers, having as many extra practices as you can is massive. So that's why, again, even if you're playing in the Chimichanga Bowl, whatever the heck it might be, like something that fans aren't necessarily saying, like, man, that's where I want to go. You get an opportunity for your players to be able to get those 15 extra practices, especially, never mind the quarterback room, knowing how young this team is. Knowing that there is a possibility, never mind of Juice Wells, but there is a possibility that Juice isn't back next year. And that wide receiver room won't only be losing Xavier Legette, but there's a possibility that you don't have Juice back. So now the urgency of being able to get these younger guys ready to go for the following season, it cranks up even more. Never mind the offensive line. Never mind some of the players in the secondary. Never mind the fact that Debo Williams will be gone at linebacker. Still a young team. Still going to be a young team next year. So any extra practices you can get would be massive. Travis talking about the total for Wells. Jay Diz says, we have a good amount of freshmen and sophomore wide receivers that haven't played at all this offseason. Will be pretty interesting in a deep wide receiver room. 18 Scotty players. Yeah. MJ Polino says, is that a Calhoun hoodie? Classic Boston joint. That's right. I was kind of disappointed that Field Yates, and I know Field's not a North Shore guy, but I had to wear the Calhoun hoodie today with him hopping on. Again, if you missed any of the interview today with Field Yates from ESPN, some really good stuff about the draft stocks. I know we've gone a little bit longer than, we always extend these shows because this is the people's show. We want to answer these questions for you guys. So certainly a long one. So if you have nothing better to do on Saturday before the game, listen to this. Give you 90 plus minutes of Gamecock football talk. Marion R. 26 says, maybe Juice felt good for the Georgia game and he re-injured it. So now he is going to make sure at this time. No question. I mentioned this on the Insiders Forum before the game. I'm on the field at the Georgia game, pregame, and I'm actually posting something on the message board. and I hear someone say, "What's up, Mike?" And it's Juice Wells. Juice was warming up. He was literally in the end zone. I'm about, 5 feet away, and he comes over to me. And I'm like, "What's going on, Juice?" And I said, "How you feeling?" He's like, "Man," "I'm feeling real good. Like, I'm feeling really, really good today." And as we saw in that opening drive, he looked really good. But unfortunately, once that adrenaline wore off, because of just that tweak with his foot, when he landed on it, that's when the injury reoccurred. And unfortunately, he's been out since then. Travis, that's more of a question for Wes or Chris. I don't want to lie to you about Jordan Seaton, offensive lineman for the class 2024. Travis says 15 extra practices will benefit the DBs, wide receivers, linebackers the most. And again, Travis, as I threw in their quarterbacks as well, but those three positions, as you mentioned, certainly would be beneficial if they have the extra 15 practices. But of course, it comes down to South Carolina having to win at least this weekend. And we could talk about next weekend and then Clemson as well. But again, South Carolina has had a lot of success against the Commodores in recent years, 15 straight wins. But in those 15 wins, as we mentioned earlier in the program, 5 of those games, including the last time Vandy was in town back in 2021, the Zeb Nolan game, where Zeb came off the bench and led the Gamecocks to victory. You have to make sure you don't sleep on this team, because in 5 of those 15 games in this last 15-game stretch, it's been decided by one possession. And with conditions expected to be a little sloppy out there, got to do a good job protecting the football, certainly against a team who's done a great job of forcing turnovers this year, tied for second in the SEC in takeaways, that being Vandy's defense. Before we wrap things up, hit a couple ad reads here on the program. It's not tax season quite yet, but it's never too early to start looking ahead. And the folks over at Liberty Tax, they can start getting that plan for you in place so that you won't have any taxiety come this tax season. Give them a call over at 803-462-5576 so that this tax season, you will be good to go and you'll know exactly where you stand, and hopefully you'll get some good money back too from Uncle Sam. Today's program is also brought to you from our good friend Clint Hammond over at the Movement Mortgage. You see his name above my head every single show. He's been a longtime supporter of Gamecock Central, as well as the lead sponsor for these GC Live shows. When Wes Mitchell, when he was trying to purchase a home with his wife, Michaela, as well as when former Gamecock quarterback and captain Perry Orth was purchasing a home with his wife, Shannon, former Gamecock volleyballer, they both called Clint Hammond. And right now, as many of you know, trying to purchase a home during this market, trying to find the lowest rate, it's not necessarily easy, but Clint and his team do an outstanding job of doing what they can to get you the lowest rate. So give Clint a call, 803-771-6933. Again, that is Clint Hammond of the Movement Mortgage. So we got one more question or comment. Jay Diz says, Juice might have rebroke something in his foot. Man, did he look good before that? He did. That one play, it looked like, man, Juice is back. Juice is back. And it's easy to say these things after the fact. I don't know if South Carolina wins that game, because they certainly had a lot of issues up front that day in the second half. And I know people don't want to give credit to Will Muschamp, but Muschamp and Kirby Smart, they did a great job with their adjustments in the second half, and USC just wasn't able to adjust to it. However, you have Juice Wells out there. I think USC has a better chance of pulling off that upset. Not saying they would have, but you have Juice out there. I think it's hard to argue, especially after what we saw in that opening drive, that you have him out there. The defenses have to plan differently around him. Never mind the fact that you had Xavier Legette out there. Now, the conditions weren't great, and I think we're talking about conditions here. We've got to go back to that game. It could be similar. There were a lot of drop balls that game. There were some beautiful throws by Spencer Rattler. If you're in a position to be able to make some catches this weekend, do what you can. I mean, I think it is nuts that some of these players still wear the gloves when it's soaking out. I think it was former Gamecock quarterback Michael Scarnecchia talking about, and I don't want to get all scientific and talking about stuff that I certainly don't know a lot about, but when your fingers get all, pruned up, when they get wet, it kind of acts as a natural glove for you, the way that your fingers prune up. Certainly you got to keep them dry, but it's a little bit easier to catch sometimes in comparison to some of these gloves out there, even the gloves that essentially feel like, stick 'em. A lot of those great gloves out there, they don't work great in wet conditions, certainly when you're playing on grass too. Well, that's going to do it for today's show. Again, if you missed any of our program, head on back to the Gamecock Central YouTube page. We have 90-plus minutes of Gamecock football talk, including an interview with ESPN's Field Yates, who was fortunate enough to join us today. Very fortunate to have Field on. He talked a lot about not just Spencer Rattler, talked about Xavier Legette, Juice Wells, TJ Sanders in there, and giving us some insight into what his thoughts are on this change for the Senior Bowl, as it is now an upperclassman bowl, which will go into effect this year. So head on back, watch that in its entirety there, or if you're a podcast listener, head on over to the Gamecock Central Podcast Network, where you can listen to this show in its entirety as well. Appreciate everyone that tuned in today. If you're going to Carolina Calls this evening, 6 o'clock, Shane Beamer, Backstreet's Grill. Maybe I'll see you there. And if not, have a safe Thursday night. And we will see you at Williams-Brice on Saturdays. The Gamecocks look to earn their second straight win in as many weeks and try to keep those bowl dreams alive as they take on the Commodores of Vanderbilt.